Good morning and welcome to Woods and Water Wanderings for this week. As I said, I'm going to look at the open face reels as we looked at the closed face reels just a little while ago. And before I get into some of these reels and differences or fine points or bad points about them, probably some of you are wondering why I am sitting here in the house looking at equipment in front of me, and instead of out ice fishing and catching perch or northerns or bluegills or whatever. But the fact is, I had undergone surgery about a week ago, and I'm still recovering. I'm not supposed to be lifting, and I assume that means I shouldn't be out on the ice slipping and sliding all over the place. Having had some surgery to remove a gallbladder from that wasn't working, and repair a simple hernia that I had, and so I'm behaving myself and doing what I ought to be doing, and letting it heal up. It's still quite sore, black and blue, and around some of the entry holes. So that gives you an idea of why I'm doing things the way I'm doing here. To start today, let me show you what I'm using for myself at this time. My present day fishing gear consists of this particular open-faced outfit. I didn't buy these together. This is a Johnson reel. Been very faithful reel for me. No problems with it. I have worn it down pretty good. There's a lot of scuff marks and a lot of wear marks on this, but it's put on a Berkley, a Riversider 8.5 foot open face rod, and that's nice long handle for control and for fighting fish, and that's one of my rods at this particular time that I have been using. And the other was, as I said, a close face, a 733 Zebco reel, and this I have used for saltwater as well as for the aspect of freshwater. And again, nice long reel seat and handle. This is a Shakespeare rod, again an 8.5 foot rod that I find to be just about right, whether I'm bank fishing, pier fishing, jetty fishing, or out of a boat. It gives me the kind of control that I'm looking for when pitching around the lily pads and the weeds and such for bass, or whether I'm looking for a nice big northern or muskie that we do look for at different times. I never paid as much attention to the open face reels as the closed face reels. I started using them first when I got into saltwater fishing. Closed face reels at that time didn't really lend themselves well to saltwater fishing in our area. So I got the open face reel, partly because you could wash it down, clean it out much easier than you could a closed face one, and keep it going longer. This is an old Ryobi that I had that I used for years on saltwater. So we will take a brief look at some of these, and some of them are junk, have no value to them whatsoever, and others are fairly nice looking pieces and a piece of history. This one is an old Pfluger that I'm going to show you in a bit. As I said, I didn't use open face reels as much until I got into saltwater fishing, and here is a fairly nice Ryobi that we use for surf fishing, and also in the the piers and the jetties and the shore that we had at that time. I think this one was probably from the 70s maybe, when I began to saltwater fish. Much easier to just clean them, to wash them down with a hose, get the salt water off them. Some people even would stretch the line off it that they used and wash that all down with their water, but you couldn't do that with a closed-faced reel. It was too time consuming, and so we went to these. Didn't catch on to using them for bass fishing, trout fishing, and such until probably the late 70s, and I started getting into smaller, Shakespeare reels and things like that I could use for the freshwater fish. We had a few. Here is a fluger, a beautiful fluger that is from, this one says it's from Akron, Ohio, a U.S. made. One of the things we'll find is that most of these now are made in China. Here's a nice Mitchell 301, and needs cleaning very badly. A lot of these have to be cleaned. I picked them, they're just the way I picked them up. But this one was made in a stamp that it's made in France. And I believe that was probably the late 50s or the early 60s, when France started to import them to the rest of Europe and to probably the United States at that point. And this Mitchell, of course, was one of the first ones to really gain popularity, I guess you would say, in the United States, especially for bass and pike fishing. And you saw a lot of them put on Fenwick rods and hollow fiberglass rods that were made at that time. Okay, obviously the difference in a open face as compared to the closed face is going to be in how the line comes off the reel. In the closed face, once you press the button, you bring the line out, it's going to come off this particular reel, but it's got a very small radius that it's going to spiral off from. If you can remember some of your lessons from physics class when you were in high school, it makes a wave of sorts. It's a circular wave that comes out. So this is a relatively small, it's already been constricted down into a relatively small opening, and it's coming off, as you can see, in very, very tight wave. And so therefore, when you get up to this end, you don't need a large, huge eye to guide that through. A guide here is relatively small diameter, as you can see. Whereas on these, once you set the bail and start pulling them off, you will notice that the line comes off in a much bigger radius, a much bigger wave, so to speak, if you can see that against my shirt there. And so it has a much larger spool that it is coming off from, and not cranked down to the level that the other is. So on that, you need sometimes a much larger guide in order to be able to keep that from piling up and snarling against that particular area. Now, the seat is also very important, because as it's put on your pole, you obviously want to have that as directly in line as you can with the center of the reel. the eyelet is, or the guide has to be as centered as good as possible. You want this to be as straight a line as possible going through that guide down to the center of the reel. If it was way out like so, if it was slanted this much, obviously you're not going to be able to thread the line through there. If it was way down here, you'd have trouble with the line hitting the blink of your rod. But it has to be a relatively shallow angle from the reel to the first guide, and that is imperative that you match the size of your reel, such as the difference here. This is a much bigger reel, not a lot off center, but a bigger reel. Anyway, match them with the size of guide and the rod. The other thing is how far it is from the end of your, how far it is up your rod blink. If it was way down here, obviously your angle is going to be a lot steeper, much harder for it to feed through the eyes. For it to be at the right distance, it has to be able to come off here in a coil and narrow down a little bit to get through that first eye. And so it's important to match your equipment in that respect. Much more important to have a match set for open face than it was for your closed face reels. Now we have many developments that have come about in the aspect of the development of seats for these open face reels. Let me give you a brief and quick view of these. The first ones were usually cork, and they were just a straight one like this. They had a couple of retainers, and I'm going to put them on a different one so I can better show you. But those were both for the closed face, but they'd have a fiberglass rod like this, and this is a pretty cheap one here, but it will work for what we're doing. And then they would have these rings of some sort where the reel would just sit under the ring, and by friction or by just pressing it on, you would have a second ring and below, and that is how you would set your rod and reel up. And they were frustrating to say the least. Some people taped them and such because, well, you're dealing with them. Sometimes these would, maybe due to weather or whatever temperatures, these would separate, and next thing you know, you got your reel in your hand and not on the rod. But for what they were, they worked quite well. So the first ones were those straight shot deals, and then they began to develop into what we use today. They had this is one from the 70s, still a very straight rod seat, but this one had a double. This had a little collar comes up over, and a double locking ring. You had two rings. One you snugged it up, and then you snugged the second one up to lock it in place, and it was pretty good. That didn't come loose very often. This is from the mid 70s. I remember getting this one, and I used this for a long time in salt water. Then they began to get a little bit sturdier. As you can see, this one that I showed you before. Still, this is more, this is an Abu rod. It's a surf rod or a large boat rod. And again, though, the handles were still the same. Then they started going from, more so from the back, they started putting it, the anchor point came from the front, and they came up with this type of locking system. And these were really good because your palm of your hand wasn't rubbing back and forth on what was keeping your reel in place all the time. So you were much more secure in that respect. But these all basically are, even though they look a little different, all basically the same type of open face combinations, whether they were larger, longer rods or shorter rods, and used quite frequently. This is a sport fisher. This is a I don't even know what this one is. The only thing I can tell you is that most of these are made in China. Once they, oh, this one is an Eagle Claw here, and this one is a Johnson. So a number of different ones there that this is a Shakespeare, this first one that I couldn't find the name on. So very different types of start, but simple starts. They were all basically the same concept: a straight handle with a seat on it, and that is what you anchored these open face reels with. As we get into the more modern ones, as I said, I would talk about getting children involved. And one of the things that Zebco came up with was a little, they call this, it's a little short, what is it, I don't think it even says on here. It's a Zebco rod and reel combination that you can buy at most big box stores, but the whole thing is maybe 36, 38 inches long, and it's got a little reel on it. It's not the best reel that I've ever seen, but it's not an ultralight. It's strictly for kids. This is a solid fiberglass rod, and supposedly it's going to stand up to the beating that a kid would give it, and you can use them off the piers, off the docks. In fact, I think it's called a dock pole, I'm not sure, but it works the same way. Actually, in some ways, this has a very good, one of the things you want to look at for a reel is to have some kind of a collar here and your take-up bail, some kind of a collar here to kind of protect your line, let it run along that smooth collar, rather than one, say, like this, that has just a bent wire, or this one, really cheap ones. I mean, you're looking at, for resale, you're looking at 50 cents for these little reels here. You're not going to pay much more than those. They're just not worth it. Okay, going back to these combos, we have the a bunch of combos that can be used for children. Here is one that is put out, and it's called an Eclipse. It is by South Bend, I believe, and the rod and reel go together. This is a collapsible rod. The ends of it just come out, and this can be a pretty good traveling set. I'm not one for the traveling much with those type rods. I have cases I put my bigger rods in, but this can be useful, and can be a good way to set up children in relatively inexpensive way. Here is a Zebco combination. It looks pretty good. It's modern looking, and it's by Zebco. It's called the Slingshot. You buy these in any of the major box stores. Most every group has one. Here's a Shakespeare reel on a Berkeley line, rod, and this is a pretty stout one. Might be good for your kids. Not a lot of real sensitive tip that they're going to snap off by catching it in the boards of the dock or whatever, but can be used quite easily. Of course, many of the closed-faced ones are very good as well. And of course, we have that little one that we were looking at earlier. As I mentioned, you want to look closely at the quality of the bail. Make sure you don't get into, and we're going to look at these a little later, get into these bales that are bent wires. They end up wearing. First of all, they will get a little groove in the corner here, and then they start to fray your line quite a bit. Any reel that is relatively good is going to have not going to have that kind of a bent wire. They're going to have some kind of a smooth rounded collar that'll catch the wire and do a good job of retrieving your line without hurting it. One of the key things, you don't want to be fighting a fish and have your line snap because it's abraded by one of these less expensive reels. We'll look at these in just a little bit.